Have you ever trusted someone for years, only to discover the betrayal had been unfolding right under your roof? In today's story, a husband uncovers the truth after a year of deception, and the way karma delivers its blow is something you won't forget. This isn't just about heartbreak, it's about revelation, justice, and freedom. Stay with me because the twist will shock you. And before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 for more unforgettable stories like this. Now, let's dive into today's story. She betrayed me for a year, but karma made her suffer even more. Most weeks split me clean down the middle. 3 days on the road managing clients, 4 at home pretending the house could not tell I had been gone. I said it was for work, for schedules, for the slow machinery of adulthood. The truth was simpler. My parent needed me, and the miles I drove to their apartment bought Melissa a space I never questioned. I trusted the routine because routine had always saved us. But sometimes the very rhythm you lean on becomes the silence that blinds you. 2 months ago, I mounted a doorbell camera and felt almost childish for enjoying the little chirp it made when it woke. One evening, while at my parents' place, it pinged. On the screen, a blurred shoulder slipped into our foyer, a smear of fabric and motion, no face, no sound but the latch. I told myself it was a delivery, yet the next day the clip was gone, not corrupted, deleted. The app said so, cheerful as a receipt. My stomach tightened. I swallowed hard, choosing what I thought was the grown man's answer, the one with taxes, paperwork, and restraint. But beneath that choice, something began to claw. Then small things leaned out of place. Towels I did not use hung to dry, diagonals I never make. A faint sweetness lingered in the hallway, the ghost of someone else's breath. A wine glass stood upside down on the rack, beating clean, part of a pair without its partner. None of it could stand in court. All of it held a shape my body recognized before my mind dared to admit it. I did not confront her. Instead, I bought 2 tiny indoor cameras and a voice recorder that woke with a word. I told myself it was for peace of mind, the way you lock a door just to hear the click. I combed through phone bills and bank statements. They were ordinary as rain. If there was a story, it lived in the shadows between transactions, in the places algorithms cannot search. On a late run to the hardware store, I met the new neighbor, Mark Johnson. He had the soft hands of a man who writes emails for a living, a good dog, a quick grin. "Nice to meet you," he said, and then, like a man offering a weather report, he mentioned a gray sedan idling in front of our house on some weeknights. "Probably nothing," he added, because men say probably nothing when they think they have already said too much. I matched his casual tone, but inside, a jolt arced through me. Waiting became a habit. I counted the minutes between Melissa's replies and learned the exact length of her gym sessions, the way a mechanic can hear a belt slipping. I could tell our garage door from any other on the street by the warble it made before it caught the track. I hated the inventory I kept in my head. Suspicion changes the posture of a man. You start to lean toward sounds. You stop breathing with the room. One night, the recorder woke to our living room air and caught a laugh. Soft, quick, not mine. Then the consonants of a man's voice bent by distance, rippling like sound through a glass of water. The clip was too warped to be proof, but it was enough to draw a line in me. People say trust dies in a single moment. They are wrong. It erodes quietly, grain by grain, until one day you notice the ground is gone. I did one gentle, reckless thing. I set my phone on the counter and spoke clearly to the empty kitchen, naming the date, the time, the strange details I had been hoarding in my skull. If I ever needed to hear the sound of my own sanity, there it would be. I washed the wine glass. I replaced the towels. I opened the back door and let the night air move through the hall as if a draft could sweep out a truth I was not yet ready to hold. The next morning, I made a rule. No scenes, no speeches. Evidence first, then words. Marriages do not combust without oxygen. Something, somewhere, was feeding a flame. Our 27 years no longer felt like a fortress. The house creaked the way houses do when a storm is still an hour away. Timbers testing their vows, whispering a sound you only notice if you stand very still and listen. Tuesday evening unfolded in the kitchen with its usual quiet. A pot simmering on the stove, Melissa drying her hands with a striped towel that had faded from years of use. Ethan had promised himself he would wait for the right moment to speak, but the truth was that such a moment would never exist. His heart hammered against his ribs, yet when he opened his mouth, his voice sounded almost too calm, as though borrowed from someone else. "I need to ask you something," he said at last, his eyes fixed not on her face but on the countertop, as though the laminate surface could steady him. "Last week, the erased video, the wine glass I didn't use, the laughter caught on the recorder. Can you help me understand?" Melissa froze. The towel hung motionless between her fingers, and the silence grew so large it felt like another person had entered the room. Her shoulders dropped. She exhaled in a way Ethan had never heard before, like surrender. She did not deny it. She did not even try to stall. Her words landed stripped bare. "Yes, I've been seeing someone. His name is David Ross." The sound of it carried a weight heavier than shouting ever could. Ethan's breath caught in his chest, but his body remained still, as though leaning back would shatter him completely. Melissa's sentences spilled out quickly, almost frantically, like stones dislodged from a cliff. It had started nearly a year ago, she confessed, during the long weeks when Ethan was away caring for his mother. At first, she called it an accident, a single night, too much wine, the illusion of being seen. But then it continued, not because she envisioned a new life with David, but because she felt invisible in the old one. She framed it with words like loneliness, resentment, and desire she believed had died. To Ethan, they sounded less like reasons and more like rationalizations for betrayal. He asked questions without raising his voice, each one measured, deliberate. When had it started? How often? Where? Did anyone else know? Melissa answered with clipped honesty, or at least the appearance of it. She admitted to protection, yes, to love, no. She called it reckless comfort. Her final words cut deeper than the confession itself. "You deserve better than what I gave you." She intended it as remorse, but to Ethan it felt like a neat ribbon tied around a bomb that had already exploded. His mind flooded with memories. The nights when they both claimed exhaustion instead of intimacy, the doctor visits charting fertility that never bore fruit, the sacrifices measured in miles driven between hospitals and offices, believing all the while that they were still on the same team. And then something inside him clicked shut. When he spoke again, his tone was almost gentle, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "There won't be screaming, no scenes for the neighbors, no gossip to feed, just truth and outcomes." Ethan pushed his chair back, stood, and walked out of the room with deliberate calm. He did not leave as a husband abandoning dinner. He left as a man who had finally stepped across an invisible line, the kind from which there was no return. Melissa raised the subject on a Sunday morning as casually as if she were suggesting a new paint color for the bedroom. Her voice was level, calm, almost businesslike. "We should probably think about what's next," she said, sliding a folded sheet of paper across the table. On it, numbers lined up in neat columns, projected home value, mortgage balance, retirement accounts. She had drawn tidy boxes for proceeds, debts, alimony. "If we sell the house, we could split the equity cleanly. The debts would divide in half. If calculations shift, I can cover limited alimony for a while. It's reasonable." Reasonable. Ethan stared at the word written in her careful pen strokes as if betrayal could be balanced like a checkbook. To her, the chaos she had detonated could be reduced to tidy arithmetic. To him, it was like someone calmly pricing the damage of a fire they had set themselves. He did not shout. He did not crumple the page in his fist. He simply folded it once more and placed it back on the table with a precision that felt colder than rage. Later that week, he booked an appointment with Claire Foster, a lawyer quietly recommended by a colleague who had already walked this road. Claire's office was bright, lined with framed diplomas and a single photograph of her with a rescue dog. She listened more than she spoke, jotting notes as Ethan laid out the story. When he finished, she leaned back, her voice pragmatic yet humane. "You have two choices," she said. Fight for spectacle or fight for stability. File, document, negotiate, protect. That's the clean path. Do you have evidence? Ethan described the erased clip, the distorted laugh on the recorder, and Melissa's direct confession. Claire nodded slowly. Enough to compel honesty and mediation, not enough to weaponize in court, which is fine. Sometimes restraint is the stronger move. He left her office with a folder of forms, each one a map to a different version of the future. There were no teenage children to shield, no spouse on the other side who could still surprise him with tenderness. Revenge here would not be public. It would not be a performance staged for neighbors or friends. Revenge would be boundary. Ethan began to reorient his days around lists. He inventoried the house. He sorted keepsakes into boxes labeled keep, discard, donate. He gathered essential documents into a fireproof folder. He scheduled appraisals. His handwriting filled yellow pads with meticulous notes, like a man rehearsing a departure no one else could yet see. He drafted rules for himself as carefully as Claire had drafted legal strategy. No contact with Melissa beyond logistics. No overnight stays under the same roof. No intimacy, not even the accidental brush of fingers that could reopen old wounds. Detachment became his practice, as precise as a surgeon's hand. But detachment was not absence. Beneath the calm, rage pulsed against his ribs with nowhere to land. He refused to let anger dictate his steps because anger, unshaped, only widened damage, so he trusted the calendar instead. He gave himself dates. File the petition by the end of the month, list the house within 60 days, move essentials into storage before summer. Build a future with no we in it, only the steady rhythm of I. The plan was not romance, it was survival. Each deadline was a rung on a ladder, each completed task a lifeline to grip while the floor beneath him shifted. At night, in the silence Melissa sometimes tried to fill with trivial small talk, Ethan repeated the rules again in his head. No scenes, no spirals, no second chances. The truth had already been spoken. Outcomes were now his to shape. Packing turned into something closer to archaeology. Every drawer, every closet felt less like storage and more like a tomb. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway, their open mouths waiting for judgment. Keep, discard, donate. Ethan reached for the top shelf first and pulled down the wedding album. Its leather cover had softened with time, the corners rounded by years of handling. Inside, the photos glowed with a joy that now felt almost fictional. Melissa in white satin, sunlight spilling across her veil, Ethan thinner, younger, believing in permanence. Their faces were flushed with the naive certainty that vows could withstand anything. Beneath the album lay a shoebox crammed with Polaroids from beach motels they once counted as luxury. Their smiles were crooked, their sunburns vivid, their bodies sprawled across striped towels like the world belonged to them alone. Ethan traced one photo with his thumb, Melissa laughing, hair tangled, sand clinging to her calves. It did not stab him, it ached. Nostalgia did not cut like a knife. It throbbed like an old bruise, deep and tender. Ticket stubs fell out in a messy scatter. Concerts where they had shouted lyrics until their throats burned, movies they had pretended to critique but secretly adored, boarding passes for trips stitched together from coupons and overtime hours. Each scrap hummed faintly with stories, but the hum had grown weak, like a cassette tape worn thin by too many plays. Then he reached the highest shelf of the bedroom closet. There in a sealed urn lay the ashes of children they never got to raise. His fingers trembled as he brought it down. The weight was small, but the room tilted beneath it. He sat cross-legged on the floor, the urn cradled between his palms, and let the silence press against him until minutes blurred into half an hour. Dust floated lazily in a shaft of afternoon light, tiny particles drifting as if they, too, remembered. Once he had imagined an old age where he and Melissa would request their ashes mingled with these tiny grains, scattered together at the quiet stretch of ocean they had once claimed as theirs. That fantasy broke cleanly now, like glass under sudden pressure. When Melissa entered later, her face was blotched from crying. Her words stumbled out in fragments. I resented it, us, that we couldn't. She admitted how grief had hardened around their infertility, how each failed attempt had turned intimacy into punishment, love into a ledger of loss. "I blamed you," she whispered, "even when I knew it wasn't fair." Ethan listened in silence. He thought of every anniversary he had wrapped in quiet restraint, shielding them both from words too sharp to speak aloud. He had believed silence was mercy. Now it felt like denial. The ashes, he realized, were the only incorruptible truth left between them. Not Melissa's confession, not his questions, not the calculations of divorce. Just this vessel, what could never be. That night he drafted a short email to Claire Foster. His words were precise. How should we handle the urn? He wasn't asking about legality. He was asking whether the law could bend to ritual, whether some closures required ceremony instead of paperwork. For days, the urn sat apart from the other boxes, untouched. He packed lamps, folded linens, taped cartons of books. But the urn remained inviolate. When at last he placed it in a smaller box padded with towels, he wrote not fragile, but simply last. Because some things were not inventory. They were history, they were memory. They were the shadows you carried even after the house itself was emptied. Night became an amplifier, louder than any argument spoken in daylight. Ethan lay flat, the ceiling above him a pale canvas, the mattress vibrating faintly with the ghosts of years that no longer fit. The quiet of 2 a.m. pressed against his chest, heavier than Melissa's absence beside him. Memories looped endlessly, like a reel that refused to break. He saw moments he had overlooked, things he had tolerated, silences he had mistaken for forgiveness. He found himself tracing the faint cracks in the ceiling as though they were constellations, inventing an astronomy to distract himself from replaying the missing doorbell footage. The deletion haunted him more than the image itself ever could. Deletion meant intent, and silence that thick never arrived by accident. To drown the noise, he began mapping his future in bullet points, find short-term housing, adjust his elder care schedule, meet with the realtor, cancel joint memberships, separate phone plans, close shared accounts. Each list became both shield and weapon, a way to impose order on the chaos betrayal had unleashed. But the lists had gaps, and in those gaps shame crept in. He wondered if he had made Melissa feel invisible when grief hollowed him out. He wondered if his steadiness had hardened into absence, if his sense of duty had disguised fear. He had carried burdens without asking for help, and in carrying them alone, perhaps he had disappeared as a husband. The thought gnawed deep. Then, like a ripcord yanked suddenly, another memory cut through the haze, the warped laughter on the recorder, the erased file. 1,000 reasons constrain a marriage, Ethan told himself, but only a few compel someone to destroy evidence. That act was deliberate, calculated, cold. It marked the line between drifting apart and outright betrayal. By 4 a.m., sleep was impossible. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet pressing into cool floorboards. Moving quietly through the house, he brewed coffee and spread papers across the kitchen table. The first light of dawn smeared across the windows as he drafted yet another moving checklist, items categorized, deadlines penciled in. If insomnia wanted his body, it would not take his purpose. The hours that others wasted in restless tossing, Ethan transformed into strategy. And in the silence, a new vow began to take shape. Not a vow to forgive Melissa, her choices belonged to her. Not a vow to avenge, revenge could not rebuild him. It was a vow to himself. Never again to vanish inside a relationship, never again to barter away his voice for the illusion of peace. If love found him again one day, it would not find a man who disappeared. It would meet a man who knew the weight of his own presence, a man who could not be erased like a digital clip. The phone rang well past 10, when the neighborhood was already pinned in silence and Ethan had almost convinced himself he might finally sleep. Melissa's name glowed on the screen, its familiarity twisted into something sharp and unwelcome. He hesitated, thumb hovering, then answered. Her voice trembled at the edges, carrying a strange mixture of apology and panic. "Ethan, please, I can't stop thinking about what I've done. Can we talk? Can we try again? He pressed the phone tighter to his ear, his tone measured, almost too steady. How many times? The silence that followed stretched like a rope pulled taut, threatening to snap. She tried to stall. Does it matter? It's over. I swear it's over. How many? Ethan repeated, his voice flat, the syllables deliberate. There was a pause, then a long exhale sagging into honesty. In the beginning, a few times, sporadic. But then, when you were traveling so much, it became often, almost every day, sometimes even on weekends. Numbers, once abstract, suddenly became a brutal kind of arithmetic. Ethan gripped the counter with his free hand as the math spun in his head, weeks, months, hundreds of hours stolen and spent elsewhere. He muted the phone, lurched toward the sink, and retched into the stainless steel basin. Nothing came up but acid. Betrayal was no longer just a wound. It had a body count, and it was measured in repetitions. He refused to ask about comparisons, preferences, or details that would turn pain into self-inflicted cruelty. That way lay madness. When he unmuted, his voice carried no tremor. I need the house to myself tomorrow. I'll be collecting important items. Don't be there. Melissa's reply blurred apology with persuasion. Of course, I'll give you space, but Ethan, please listen. We can fix this. I'll go to therapy. I'll do anything. It's over with him. I was lost. But I've found my way back. You have to believe me. He let her finish. Then quietly he said, I'm done being the kind of man who negotiates against his own dignity. The line went silent. Her muffled sobs lingered a few seconds before she hung up. Ethan lowered the phone and stared at the dark window's reflection. His own face looked hollow, but his eyes were clearer than they had been in years. He typed a curt update to Claire. She admitted frequency. I'll need the house secured. No embellishments, no desperate plea for advice, just fact. Then with deliberate calm, he opened his work calendar and booked a day off. Tomorrow would not be for emails or deadlines. Tomorrow would be for boxing his life room by room, for closing doors behind him, for putting locks between himself and the wreckage. He rinsed the sink, scrubbed away the sour residue, and poured himself a glass of water. The house creaked around him, an old companion shedding its skin. He felt hollow, yes, but the hollowness now had edges. Edges he could grip, sharp enough to cut a new path forward. By morning, he would stand in that house alone, no longer bargaining with ghosts, ready to begin. Ethan arrived early, the folded list of tasks heavy in his pocket like a talisman. The house, stripped of warmth, waited for him, its hollow rooms echoing with silence, its boxes stacked like punctuation marks in a story that was ending. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and inhaled. For a fleeting second, he believed he could endure the day with nothing more than cardboard, tape, and detachment. Then the silence fractured. Water thundered through the pipes, a shower running upstairs. Ethan froze. Melissa. The violation of their agreed boundary twisted in his gut. She had promised to stay away, promised he could pack undisturbed. The sound of running water was not only disruption, it was mockery. His first impulse was fury. He pulled out his phone, thumbs drafting a text sharp enough to cut flesh. You don't respect anything, not vows, not boundaries, not even the simplest request. But as quickly as he typed, he deleted. Sending it would give her what she wanted, engagement. He would not barter rage for attention. He stepped outside, the autumn air biting into his lungs like cold steel. On the sidewalk, Mark Johnson, the new neighbor who had once casually mentioned the gray sedan, strolled by. Mark waved, introduced himself properly, asked if everything was all right. The timing felt cruel. Ethan forced a polite nod, though his jaw ached with restraint. Moments later, Melissa emerged. Damp hair clung to her shoulders, a gym bag slung across her arm. Her eyes darted between Ethan and Mark. Can we talk? She asked, tone rehearsed, as though she had practiced this scene in the mirror. Mark caught the tension instantly. He gave an awkward nod and quickened his steps down the block, retreating from the storm. Inside, Melissa set her bag down, folding her arms in that defensive posture Ethan knew too well. I couldn't check into my temporary place yet, she said. I just needed to shower after the gym. The word gym landed like a slap. That excuse, the same alibi she had leaned on for months, was radioactive now, glowing with every betrayal it had concealed. Ethan's pulse hammered. He wanted to shout, to unleash the storm that had been gathering inside him for weeks, but he didn't. He inhaled deeply, letting the anger settle into bone instead of spilling into the room. His voice, when it came, was steady. "We agreed. Boundaries matter. You need to leave." Melissa opened her mouth as if to argue, but the steel in his tone froze her. With a huff, she grabbed her keys and disappeared into the garage. The door ground shut behind her, metallic and final. Silence returned. This time it felt medicinal. Ethan descended to the basement and picked up where he had left off, folding winter coats, boxing tools, labeling the relics of a shared life. His pulse still raced, but every crease of tape across cardboard, every neat label steadied him. He chose not to smash anything, though the urge flared when his hand brushed one of Melissa's scarves. He chose not to write the manifesto forming in his mind, a detailed record of every lie, every absence. He chose not to scorch her reputation on social media, though the temptation whispered like a siren. Restraint was not forgiveness. It was survival. It was the quiet discipline of refusing to build shrines to her chaos. As he stacked another box by the basement door, Ethan understood. Public shame would come for Melissa in time, carried by her own choices, her own unraveling. But he would not be its architect. His power was not in spectacle. His power was in walking away intact, with dignity unbroken. That evening, Ethan's phone lit up with a message longer than any Melissa had ever sent. Her words stretched across the screen in neat paragraphs, remorse braided tightly with rationalization. She wrote about regret, about therapy, about the need to understand why instead of obsessing over what. She proposed counseling, a cooling-off period before finalizing divorce, as if betrayal could be dissected like an academic debate. Ethan read it twice. The phrases rang hollow. He knew this script, the careful pivot from guilt to analysis, the plea to turn an affair into a puzzle instead of a wound. In her framing, therapy was not a mirror. It was a reset button, a chance to pretend the infection hadn't already spread through everything. He wasn't opposed to therapy. He believed in its value when it came to reflection, to helping people untangle themselves from silence. But he knew what Melissa really wanted, not truth, not repair. She wanted erasure, a clean slate for a history that had already scorched its way into their bones. Still, Ethan allowed himself a single concession, one conversation. He wrote back with boundaries as precise as court orders, a public place, strict rules, no blaming, no rewriting timelines, no evasions, only precise answers. If she agreed, he would come prepared. That night he drafted a list, his handwriting tight and deliberate. The questions were surgical. When was the first contact? When was the last? Was protection used always, sometimes, never? Who among our friends or acquaintances knew? During your intimacy, was I mocked? Was I compared? It wasn't masochism, it was defense against ghosts. Ethan had seen too many men haunted by unanswered questions, circling the black hole of what if decades later. He would not allow ambiguity to metastasize into his future. When he shared the plan with a close friend, the reply was blunt. Liars rarely become archivists of truth under pressure. Don't expect a ledger, expect a story tailored to your patience. His therapist added another perspective. Closure is rarely granted, Ethan, it's constructed. You build it from what you choose to accept, not from what they choose to disclose. Both warnings lodged inside him, yet he decided to proceed anyway. Not because he trusted Melissa, but because he trusted himself. He needed to know that years later, when he looked back, he could say he had asked, that he had faced the chance for truth without flinching. If Melissa answered honestly, he would find clarity. If she dodged, the silence itself would tell him more than any confession. Either way, the story would move forward. As he folded the paper list and slipped it into his wallet, a strange calm settled over him. It was not hope, not reconciliation, just the steady rhythm of a man bracing for impact, unwilling to close his eyes when the collision came. The cafe smelled faintly of burnt espresso and cinnamon, but Ethan barely noticed. He sat across from Melissa, the folded sheet of questions heavy in his pocket, though he already knew he might not need it. Her eyes were rimmed red, her hands restless, tapping against the table in nervous percussion. She began with a monologue, one he had already heard in fragments: infertility, resentment, years without intimacy. Her voice rose and fell with the cadence of a grievance rehearsed so often it now sounded like scripture. Ethan let her speak. He didn't interrupt. He let the words spill out like water leaking from a cracked pipe, persistent, inevitable, impossible to patch. When silence finally settled between them, Ethan inhaled deeply and spoke with a clarity that startled even him. "I once told you I feared intimacy after our losses," he said, voice steady but edged with pain. "Grief made it unbearable. Shame twisted itself into every touch. I opened myself to you. I let you see the rawest part of me." His throat tightened, but he pressed on. "And instead of meeting me with compassion, you turned that confession into vindication for a year of deceit." Melissa blinked, lips parting as though to defend herself, but no words came. Ethan did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you understand what that means? Vulnerability was supposed to be our currency. Now it's a compromised file. I can never open myself to you again. That part of me is gone." The table between them might as well have been an ocean. Melissa reached across, fingers trembling, but Ethan leaned back just slightly, the gesture enough to sever the attempt. He continued, his voice low but unwavering. "There were nights after I discovered everything when I thought about ending my life. That's what this marriage cost me, and that is why it has to end. I will not risk becoming that man again." The words dropped into the air like lead. Melissa's eyes widened, a flash of panic breaking through her veneer of control. For a moment, her mouth worked as if to beg, as if to recite promises of therapy and redemption. But Ethan had already shifted inward, his resolve impenetrable. He stood, pushing the chair back gently, and placed a few bills on the table. His final sentence was neither cruel nor tender. It was surgical. "I'm not walking away to win an argument. I'm walking away to save my life." The door to the cafe swung shut behind him with the softest click, a sound so small it might have gone unnoticed, yet it carried the weight of 27 years. For Ethan, that muted sound was louder than any slam. It was punctuation. The end of a sentence he no longer had the strength or the desire to keep reading. Claire's office smelled faintly of ink and leather, the air-conditioned chill carrying the weight of ceremony. Ethan sat across from her, pen in hand, and signed where she pointed. Each stroke was deliberate, heavier than it should have been. When she slid the final page across the polished desk, the reality sharpened. The marriage was no longer just broken. It was now a matter of law. Process servers did their work with quiet efficiency, delivering papers with no judgment, no hesitation. Somewhere across town, Melissa opened the door and accepted the envelope, and for the first time since her confession, the consequences stood before her in physical form. She retained counsel quickly. Within days, her lawyer returned a flurry of edits, red-line demands that read less like negotiation and more like provocation. Half of debts she had not borne, inflated alimony shaped by entitlement, veiled threats about what a judge might see. But Ethan remained steady. He refused to answer venom with venom. With Claire at his side, he outlined the terms with surgical clarity. The house would be listed and proceeds divided according to law. Retirement accounts split by statute. Each would carry their own debts incurred after separation. And there would be no spousal support beyond what was strictly statutory. He added one more clause, an addendum Claire praised as both shrewd and humane, protection against Melissa's future health care debts. She had ignored annual checkups for years, dismissing symptoms with a shrug. Ethan knew the risks lurking beneath. He would not be tethered to liabilities for a woman who had already abandoned the vows they once shared. With terms set, logistics consumed his days. Realtor walkthroughs, repair estimates, photographs staged to make the house appear less like a battlefield. Ethan packed his essentials into 2 duffel bags and moved into a friend's spare room, a modest space with a single bed, 1 coffee mug, and a towel that only his hands would touch. He began to learn the muscle memory of solitude. No shared calendars pinging reminders of anniversaries. No double set of shoes by the door. The silence, once suffocating, stretched now into something breathable. At night, he sat at a borrowed desk, case law printouts spread around him. He barely understood half of it, but he underlined words that sounded like freedom. Final decree. Dissolution. Each phrase became a mantra, each highlight a brick in the wall he was building between his past and his future. Melissa's lawyer continued to posture, to needle, to demand. But Ethan, for the first time in years, felt unshaken. The papers were more than documents, they were a declaration. And as he lay in the quiet of that borrowed room, Ethan realized something profound. Endings were not always loud. Sometimes they arrived in the shuffle of paperwork, in the click of a realtor's camera, in the scratch of a highlighter across unfamiliar legalese. Each sound, each mark was not loss. It was liberation. Melissa's collapse came on a Thursday afternoon. She was at the grocery store, halfway through the produce aisle, when her chest clenched and the world narrowed into a tunnel of fluorescent light. A stranger called 911. By the time Ethan's phone vibrated on his desk at work, she was already in the ER. When he arrived, she lay pale beneath hospital blankets, trembling, and Roman IV line dripping into her arm. Dr. Reynolds, the attending physician, pulled Ethan aside. Preliminary scans suggested ovarian cancer, likely stage 2B, though more tests were needed. The word cancer landed not like a weapon, but like a stone sinking into a well. For a moment, Ethan stood suspended between two truths. On one side, the betrayal that had shattered their life together. On the other, the raw fragility of a body unraveling under illness. Whatever temptation the word karma held, he resisted. Suffering was not a ledger he could balance. It was not his victory to claim. He did not gloat. He did not allow the flicker of dark satisfaction to take root, though it tried at the edges of his thoughts. Instead, he breathed deeply and remembered the years when Melissa's body had been the center of their shared hopes and heartbreaks. This, he decided, was not the arena for revenge. Still, clarity was needed. He met with Claire again, laying out the situation with the same precision he had carried through every step. Could he move back temporarily to assist without jeopardizing the divorce? Could medical liabilities be shielded by contract? Claire assured him, yes. In-house separation was permissible with explicit terms, no intimacy, no financial entanglement. As for healthcare costs, protective language could be drafted to shield him from future debts. Ethan weighed his conscience against the history that chained them. Then he chose. He would help. Not as her husband, not as her partner, but as a man acting without hatred. When he told Melissa, his voice was steady, clipped of all illusions. I will support you through surgery and initial treatment, but the divorce proceeds. She broke then, shoulders folding inward, tears streaming across skin that already looked thinner, frailer. In between sobs, she promised cooperation in the settlement. For once, her words carried no performance, only exhaustion. Ethan kept his commitments. He scheduled hospital visits around his job and his mother's care. He sat through consultations, asked clear questions, filled a notebook with medication lists and side effects. He drove her home after procedures, placed blankets gently over her, then retreated to the spare bedroom they had designated as his. Every action was routine, deliberate, like gripping the railing of a staircase in a storm. He would not stumble back into old roles, nor surrender to illusions of reconciliation. The future had not softened. The betrayal had not vanished. But Ethan recognized something essential. Revenge did not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant refusing to become what had hurt you. Melissa's suffering was not his victory. His victory was choosing what kind of man he would be while walking toward a future without her. Melissa's collapse came on a Thursday afternoon. She was at the grocery store, halfway through the produce aisle, when her chest clenched and the world narrowed into a tunnel of fluorescent light. A stranger called 911. By the time Ethan's phone vibrated on his desk at work, she was already in the ER. When he arrived, she lay pale beneath hospital blankets, trembling, and Roman 4 line dripping into her arm. Dr. Reynolds, the attending physician, pulled Ethan aside. Preliminary scans suggested ovarian cancer, likely stage 2B, though more tests were needed. The word cancer landed not like a weapon, but like a stone sinking into a well. For a moment, Ethan stood suspended between two truths. On one side, the betrayal that had shattered their life together. On the other, the raw fragility of a body unraveling under illness. Whatever temptation the word karma held, he resisted. Suffering was not a ledger he could balance. It was not his victory to claim. He did not gloat. He did not allow the flicker of dark satisfaction to take root, though it tried at the edges of his thoughts. Instead, he breathed deeply and remembered the years when Melissa's body had been the center of their shared hopes and heartbreaks. This, he decided, was not the arena for revenge. Still, clarity was needed. He met with Claire again, laying out the situation with the same precision he had carried through every step. Could he move back temporarily to assist without jeopardizing the divorce? Could medical liabilities be shielded by contract? Claire assured him, yes. In-house separation was permissible with explicit terms, no intimacy, no financial entanglement. As for healthcare costs, protective language could be drafted to shield him from future debts. Ethan weighed his conscience against the history that chained them. Then he chose. He would help. Not as her husband, not as her partner, but as a man acting without hatred. When he told Melissa, his voice was steady, clipped of all illusions. I will support you through surgery and initial treatment, but the divorce proceeds. She broke then, shoulders folding inward, tears streaming across skin that already looked thinner, frailer. In between sobs, she promised cooperation in the settlement. For once, her words carried no performance, only exhaustion. Ethan kept his commitments. He scheduled hospital visits around his job and his mother's care. He sat through consultations, asked clear questions, filled a notebook with medication lists and side effects. He drove her home after procedures, placed blankets gently over her, then retreated to the spare bedroom they had designated as his. Every action was routine, deliberate, like gripping the railing of a staircase in a storm. He would not stumble back into old roles, nor surrender to illusions of reconciliation. The future had not softened. The betrayal had not vanished. But Ethan recognized something essential. Revenge did not always mean destruction. Sometimes it meant refusing to become what had hurt you. Melissa's suffering was not his victory. His victory was choosing what kind of man he would be while walking toward a future without her. Chemotherapy began on a gray Monday, clouds sagging low over the hospital roof as if even the sky felt the weight. Melissa sat in a recliner, a wool blanket across her lap, the Roman 4 needle taped into the fragile vein of her arm. A nurse explained the side effects in a rehearsed gentleness: nausea, fatigue, hair loss. But Ethan only caught fragments. His focus was on the clipboard, the calendar already inked with appointments that would dominate the next 6 months. He became the manager of her body's war. He organized meal deliveries from neighbors who still didn't know the truth, arranged rides when he couldn't drive her himself, labeled pill bottles with precise instructions in his block handwriting. The rhythm of care was strangely familiar, like the years he had spent tending to his father's illness. Yet this was heavier. This was not loyalty born of family, but mercy braided with detachment. Parallel to every infusion drip, another battle advanced. Claire sent updates, draft revisions, settlement terms. Melissa had resisted some clauses at first, but her diagnosis shifted her calculations. She no longer contested the division of assets, no longer pressed for spousal support, no longer fought to entangle him in debts. Ethan held the line with quiet firmness. No delays, he repeated. No blurring the separation, no rewriting history. Melissa apologized often, her voice cracked and thin, a rosary of regret. She said she wished she could undo the past, that she had never wanted things to end this way. Sometimes in the long hours when the chemo left her shivering, she reached for his hand. Ethan let her fingers hover close, but his own stayed still. Mercy was not intimacy. It was in those moments that Ethan realized how his revenge had transformed. Months earlier, he had imagined ruin, exposing her, shaming her, dismantling every comfort she still clung to. But sitting beside a woman hollowed by illness, he saw the futility of fire. Scorched earth would not restore him. His revenge had become quieter, more exacting. He refused to let her manipulate the narrative into one of noble sacrifice or mutual drift. She would not reduce the affair to a footnote. She would not recast his care as proof of reconciliation. He told her one evening, voice calm but edged with steel, "I'll help you get through this treatment, but when it ends, the divorce is final. No negotiation, no rewriting." She nodded through tears, and in her eyes he saw recognition. His boundary was unbreakable. Weeks folded into each other, chemo cycles, settlement drafts, realtor meetings. Ethan signed papers with a steady hand even when his stomach nodded. He poured Melissa ginger tea during her worst nausea, then opened Claire's emails to confirm the next step in dissolving their marriage. Compassion and detachment moved in parallel like two rails of the same track. One night, after dropping Melissa home, Ethan stood in front of the mirror in his temporary apartment. The man looking back at him had lines deeper than last year, but his eyes, they were steady. They no longer flickered with suspicion, no longer hollowed by despair. That was his victory, not her punishment, not her suffering, not even the stamped decree of dissolution. His revenge was silent. He had reclaimed himself, and nothing she could say or suffer or beg for could ever take that from him again. The house sold on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and endings. Ethan signed the closing documents with deliberate strokes, each signature a quiet declaration that a chapter was sealed. Movers carried out the furniture, the photographs, the remnants of a marriage built piece by piece and undone in the same way. What mattered most fit into only a few boxes, labeled in his neat handwriting and stacked in the back of a rented truck. The urn he carried himself, cradled against his chest as though its fragile ceramic weight demanded reverence. Melissa's prognosis remained uncertain. Dr. Reynolds was pragmatic. The cancer had not spread aggressively, but chemotherapy was only the first battle in a war that could twist without warning. Ethan listened, nodded, stored the facts. He showed her kindness when updates arrived, but he no longer let her illness draft him back into the role of husband. She was someone he had once loved, someone he still respected as human, but she was no longer his home. His new home was a modest apartment near work, nothing ornate, but touched with morning light that poured through the windows without ghosts attached. In those rooms there were no echoes of erased footage, no faint perfume clinging to towels he hadn't used. He cooked for one, simple meals of pasta, roasted vegetables, eggs fried in butter, and found comfort in their plain sufficiency. Evening walks became his ritual, not toward any destination, but simply to remind himself that his body was still capable of motion, his life still capable of direction. Visiting his elderly parent no longer carried the weight of penance. These trips were choices now, not escape routes. He lingered longer at the bedside, listening to stories repeated for the 100th time, and found grace in their repetition. Care no longer meant abandoning himself. It meant anchoring himself to what mattered. At night, he opened a journal, not to write about betrayal, but to write rules for the man he wanted to be if love ever found him again. Rule 1, never abandon yourself inside a relationship. Rule 2, resentments must be spoken before they calcify. Rule 3, choose curiosity over pride. Rule 4, calendars should hold the other person's presence, never erase it. They were not commandments. They were guardrails, reminders for a life reclaimed one boundary at a time. Melissa's texts arrived sporadically, updates about fatigue, about test results, about small victories like tolerating food without nausea. Ethan replied with brief kindness, always direct, never laced with ellipses. There were no cliffhangers left between them, no threads dangling that could unravel again. She belonged to his past. His present belonged to him. One quiet Sunday, he drove to the ocean. The urn rode in the passenger seat, buckled in like a silent companion. He walked to the water's edge, the horizon a seamless line of gray-blue, and stood with the urn in his hands. For years, he had imagined scattering the ashes with Melissa, a shared ritual of grief and closure. Now he understood closure was not something shared. Closure was something claimed. He did not open the urn, not yet. Some ceremonies required the right witness, and the only witness who mattered was the man he was still becoming. He turned back from the water without ceremony, lighter by nothing you could weigh and everything you could feel. The tide rushed behind him, carrying its own endings and beginnings, and Ethan realized the same tide lived in him too. The marriage was gone. The betrayal was history. What remained was a man walking forward, unburdened, unafraid, and finally free. And that brings us to the end of today's story. She betrayed me for a year, but karma made her suffer even more. Betrayal always leaves scars, but sometimes karma writes the final chapter in ways no one expects. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's place? Would you walk away quietly, or would you seek revenge? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. And if this story struck you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us here on Cheating Stories 7 for more powerful stories of betrayal, revenge, and redemption. Until next time, thank you for watching.